Well, welcome to Eldorado Park, coming to you from Nicholson Street. And this is literally on the scene where Nathaniel Julies took his last breath last week. And we're focusing today on not just Eldorado Park, not just justice for Nathaniel Julies, but on coloured communities and their plight. Coloured communities for the longest time have said that they feel as though they are invisible. They have said for the longest time that they feel that they are being marginalised by the government of the day. And there are so many issues. You talk about coloured communities and always it's the stereotypes that are first that come to mind. But there's so much more to coloured communities and their identities. And this is where I want to bring in our guest this morning, Eusebius McKaiser, commentator, political analyst, and of course an author, who's going to help us unpack these layers that the community has to deal with. Eusebius, thanks so much for speaking to us this morning, for coming out here to Eldorado Park. And this is a sad scene, but it's an all too familiar scene, if we're being honest.
It is, Sakina, and this story has captured the imagination of the country. It has captured the imagination of the world. And I think one of the reasons it did so is because this poor 16-year-old boy, Nathaniel, had Down syndrome. And that's an important point to make because we keep in the media referring to that, and it's true. But it also tells you how way too many coloured teenagers, coloured men, black men the world over, you almost have to qualify to get sympathy from the world. In his case, his innocence is now official because he had an intellectual or some kind of mental disability. But the truth of the matter is, if you live in these communities, as you said earlier on TV, whether it's Eldorado Park, Bontehevel, whether it is the northern areas in Port Elizabeth, every single day you experience social marginalization, political marginalization, police brutality, and that is regardless of what your body is endowed with. I mean, Nathaniel's body was obviously a body that struggled in a world that is ableist. And I think we rightly are moved by the fact that an innocent boy with Down syndrome was killed. But the truth of the matter is, if you live in one of our communities, every single day is a struggle, regardless of your body.
And I think this is why this particular broadcast is so important, Eusebius. And it's important to note that when we came out here this morning, it was not on our list of things to do, to speak to the family, to the parents of Nathaniel Julies. They, in fact, called for us to come in and talk to them. And as a parent myself, first and foremost, as a parent who has lost a child, I understand what it means to relive grief. But there's also something cathartic about telling that story. And you can hear that in the family's expression, and you can see that in the expression of the broader community here who just want to be heard.
Sakina, that's absolutely right. You are from the community. You are a parent. Your child is here with us, hopefully getting paid for the extra work that he is doing. You know exactly what this family is going through. We grew up in council houses ourselves. We aspire to be the first ones in our family to break out of the poverty trap that coloured communities are found in. No one who comes from our communities will feel slighted by the visibility of coloured communities this morning on Morning Live, because it does not happen. And listening to it, the mom and the dad telling their story, it's a story that's too familiar. In a couple of minutes, we will hear stories from other members of the community who've lost their children to police brutality. And it's not about an Olympics of suffering. Of course, there are many poor communities. There are poor Indian communities. There are poor Black African communities. There are poor colored communities. And we shouldn't pit poor communities against poor communities. But what is important is that every community that is poor and marginalized has got its own inner workings and its own narrative and its own voices that must be lifted to the surface. And the truth about colored communities is that our poor marginalized communities fight harder to be heard and to be rendered visible. And as you just said, if we are described in stereotypes. It's usually a story about gangsterism, about drug addiction, about theft, violence, murder. It is never a positive story. We are not this morning broadcasting about great colored artists political analysts, broadcasters, who are here yet again with a story that tugged at the heartstrings, because we almost anthropologize colored communities in South Africa rather than talking about our contributions and our rights as citizens to also enjoy flourishing.
And this is what we want to get at this morning here in Eldorado Park. It's about giving a voice to an otherwise voiceless community. And I want to start by looking at identity, Eusebius, because one of the realities of being colored in South Africa is that you're almost made to feel apologetic for being colored. You almost have to explain yourself as being deserving of a place under the sun, the South African sun, a place at the table where others feed from. And it starts with things like a cultural identity that you have to feel apologetic for, because you speak a language that your former colonizer, the former oppressor, the oppressive regime of this country spoke. And it starts with things like that. Why do colored people have to apologize for who they are?
You know, Sakina, that's such a deep and complicated and important point. But let me say this to just frame a conversation people can have way beyond our broadcast today. And you and I are committed as journalists to come back to this story on many platforms. It's interesting. Colored people are almost made to justify even using the terminology colored. And older colored people, a generation older than you and I, who are members of the African National Congress, will often enter this conversation. Some of them may be quite annoyed as they are listening to me now, with a commitment to non-racialism. But what they really mean is we must all subsume ourselves under the category black. But why can't we have complex identities? Many black South Africans are allowed to have hybrid identities, to say, I'm a South African, I'm a black South African, but I'm Xhosa speaking. Why is it so complicated if Eusebius wants to say, I'm politically a black South African, but I'm culturally colored? And there's nothing weird, there's nothing incoherent about having a hybrid South African identity. And I shouldn't have to apologize for it. And the irony is that the people who will criticize me for saying that are the first ones to show a complete disinterest in the particular struggles of colored communities, but who want to pretend that the broader category of black is enough for us to understand the politics and the struggles of all poor communities. And we've got to say that that is absolute balderdash. Even though we want to not make the ghost of Verwoerd be the winner in the conversations between blacks and coloreds, the reality is, because of the Group Areas Act, because of the apartheid legislation in the middle of the 20th century, communities like these are homogenous colored communities with very particular struggles that are internal to the colored identity. So I, for example, identify as black, which is almost like a political category. But the reality is, on a cultural level, there's a cultural grammar that we can speak as colored people in the street that those who don't identify as colored cannot be a part of. So I reject any idea of non-racialism that wants us as colored people to pretend that we don't have a particular cultural grammar.
And one sees this often when you raise the colored question. As you say, when people have to justify why they want to self-identify as colored. And yet this is a reality. The language issue, which is so key to culture. Not only are you marginalized because Afrikaans is jou huistaal, but the whole Afrikaans question in itself is an interesting one, because there's cultural appropriation on the part of Afrikaners in South Africa in that respect as well. Die beginsels van die Afrikaanse taal, die kultuurhistoriese beginsel van die Afrikaanse taal, Eusebius, that identifies why we speak in the different dialects that we speak Afrikaans in this country. And yet, colored people are told, jy praat kombuis Afrikaans. So it's such a complex issue. It's such a complex struggle for right of place in this society.
You're absolutely right. And even language is an important part. You know, when I write on your Facebook page, I write in Afrikaans, because that's the Afrikaans that we speak. Ek praat nie die Afrikaans van Rian Kruiwagen nie. Ek kan nie pretend daai is my Afrikaans nie. Maar hoeveel Afrikaans skrywers wat kleerling is in Suid-Afrika vandag skryf in die dialek wat ons praat in ons gemeenskappe, Sakina. Dis een wat ek aan dink, Nathaniel Julies, wat skryf vir die rapport. Maar behalwe hom kan ek nie dink nie. En as jy skryf, dan is dit die Afrikaner se weergawe van Afrikaans wat die official Afrikaans is. So whether we talk linguistic oppression and marginalisation, economic marginalisation, political marginalisation, the reality is that coloured communities are not just invisibilized, we are also scolded by the rest of the country for wanting to talk about particularity.
And then, of course, there's the inequality that is all too familiar to all South Africans. And particularly stark in a community such as this. As you said, the apartheid legislation that gave rise to areas such as Eldorado Park, the Group Areas Act. And then fast forward to where we find ourselves today, where even by government's own very blunt instruments, like affirmative action legislation, where you look at the employment equality report, that shows year after year, 20 years on, that colored and black women in particular, colored and black youth in particular, are underrepresented. They are the ones who are not enjoying right of place in the workplace, even by government's own blunt instruments. And yet, companies are so nonchalant, they're so flippant. They don't care to meet those racial quotas, those targets. They even budget to pay the fines.
I really got nothing to add. You know, my heart breaks when I look at coloured youngsters on the street here where we are in Eldorado Park. And I think to myself, the economic question must be also at the heart of this national conversation we are framing today. We can't talk about how do we get coloured communities to be integrated and to not be marginalized without dealing with economic, Sakina. And the truth of the matter is that many of the young coloured youth that we see walking up and down here in Eldos, many of them won't realize their potential. And the reason they won't realize their potential is because of the inequality that you just articulated. So we must connect the dots between inequality and marginalization.
So we're going to leave it there for now. We're going to speak to parents whose children have been killed at the hands of those who need to serve and protect us. We're going to speak to community leaders. We're going to highlight more of the issues that we have to deal with here in Eldorado Park. But this is where I have to say goodbye to our SABC 2 viewers. So I'm going to hand it back to you in studio, Leanne.
All right, I'm just going to say goodbye as well. We'll continue.